Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm standing today at report stage on this Bill S-7 before us with this very unfortunate short title of the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act. I stand in opposition to the main motion, Mr. Speaker, and in support of the NDP's proposed amendments to the bill. Mr. Speaker, I want to stress that I support the intent of this bill. No woman or child should be subject to any form of violence, and certainly not the forms of gender-based violence such as forced marriages, polygamy, and underage marriages that this bill purports to address. Further, Mr. Speaker, the fact of these forms of gender-based violence in Canadian society is not in dispute here, and neither is the fact that there are things that we can do and ought to do to prevent and respond to the practices in issue. But, Mr. Speaker, this bill is not the appropriate response and needs at a minimum to be amended because it threatens to aggravate, not help, existing circumstances and further victimize or re-victimize those subject to the practices that the bill purports to address. The precautionary principle ought to apply here, Mr. Speaker. The Conservative government has heard enough from enough knowledgeable people on the matter of this bill, from those with experience and expertise in these matters, to stop this here, to take a step back and rethink its approach to this issue before it does more harm than good to people who need help. Here are the main provisions of the bill, Mr. Speaker. It amends the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act to make polygamy grounds for inadmissibility or removal from Canada for immigrants and permanent residents if there are reasonable grounds to believe that these individuals have practiced, are practicing, or may in future practice polygamy. It amends the Civil Marriage Act to make free and enlightened consent to marriage a legal requirement and to require that any previous marriage be dissolved or declared null before a new marriage is contracted, and to make 16 years of age the minimum legal age for marriage. It amends the Criminal Code to clarify that it is an offence for an officiant to knowingly solemnize a marriage in contravention of federal law, to make an offence to celebrate, aid, or participate in a marriage rite or ceremony knowing that one of the persons being married is doing so against their will or is under the age of 16, to make an offence to remove a child from Canada in order to marry a child against their will or if the child is under 16, to allow a judge to issue a peace bond for a period of up to 2 years if a person is suspected on reasonable grounds of preparing to force someone else to marry a child or to remove a child from Canada for one of these purposes, and to address the issue of so-called honor killings to limit the defense of provocation to circumstances in which the victim engaged in conduct that would constitute an indictable offence under the Criminal Code that's punishable by 5 years or more in prison. But, Mr. Speaker, stakeholders and expert witnesses have testified before the Senate Standing Committee on Human Rights and the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration that this bill is also likely to have many and serious unintended consequences. For example, the bill makes no provision to allow women who are conditional permanent residents to remain in Canada if their polygamous partner is deported. There is no clear definition of polygamy, leading likely to confusion and potentially arbitrary decisions regarding deportation and inadmissibility and discrimination against nationals from certain countries. UNICEF has expressed concerns, Mr. Speaker, that the bill would criminalize minors who celebrate, aid, or participate in forced marriages, and UNICEF has recommended exemptions for children and young people from certain provisions in the bill. Criminalization in the context of family and social relations, Mr. Speaker, may end up simply driving these practices underground. In all of this, Mr. Speaker, the bill falls in a long line of socially insensitive, ham-fisted and unsophisticated responses to complex social issues by this Conservative government. In March 2012, for example, the Conservatives introduced new measures to crack down on marriage fraud, including the requirement for a sponsored spouse to live with their sponsor for 2 years or face deportation and possible criminal charges. Clearly, Mr. Speaker, this measure leaves women reluctant to report abuse because they fear losing permanent residency and consequently vulnerable to abuse. In April 2014, Conservative member for Mississauga South introduced a motion which purported to deal with forced marriages by banning marriages by proxy or telephone, for example, from qualifying for spousal sponsorship. But, Mr. Speaker, distance marriages of this sort are largely conducted by refugees, and so we have the consequence that this motion would serve to limit family reunification rather than limit forced marriages. These are the kinds of sensitivities, nuances, understandings, etc., missing from the Conservative government's worldview, and it's problematic, Mr. Speaker. And beyond that, and just as egregiously, Mr. Speaker, this Conservative government forgoes opportunities to even consider, much less heed, the advice of those who actually understand the complexity of these issues. For example, during the House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration study on strengthening the protection of women in our immigration system, most witnesses insisted on the fact that newcomers must be informed in their language of origin and before coming to Canada of their rights in Canada and the resources available to them in Canada. Although the committee recommended in its report to the House of Commons, quote, that the Government of Canada expand pre-arrival orientation to ensure sponsored spouses receive information in a language they understand and to ensure that the topics covered include gender equality, women's rights, their legal rights, what constitutes abuse in Canada, and how to seek help, end quote. No funds were earmarked in the 2015 budget to implement this recommendation. Herein is another example, Mr. Speaker, of the government ignoring expertise, foregoing data and information, and in so doing, putting people at risk, sacrificing vulnerable people on the altar of political expediency. And I call it political expediency quite deliberately, Mr. Speaker, because the truth here is that so much of what's in this bill actually duplicates existing laws. For example, the bill amends the Civil Marriage Act to make free and enlightened consent legal requirements for marriage, but these requirements already exist as part of the Civil Code of Quebec and common law in other provinces. The bill limits the defense of provocation ostensibly to exclude honor killings, but courts have already ruled that the concept of honor and a culturally driven sense of what is an appropriate response do not count as provocation under the criminal code. Canadian Criminal Code already provides recourse relevant in most cases involving forced marriages prior to and after marriage, as well as in cases of traveling with a minor with the intent to force them to marry. There's a broad range, Mr. Speaker, of existing criminal code provisions, including everything from intimidation to forcible confinement to sexual assault, that deal with these issues already. So much of what we're talking about here today, Mr. Speaker, here in this House stands as so fully representative of the 4 years of the 41st Parliament and the style and substance of this Conservative government. They take complex social issues with real victims and respond the only way they seem to know how, with their reflex to criminalization, without regard to evidence, experience, or expertise, or the potential of the unintended consequences of their reflex. Witness their response to the over 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women. No inquiry, no search for intelligence or understanding, just criminalize as though that helps victims, as though that's somehow going to prevent having more victims. And with so few days left in the 41st Parliament, Mr. Speaker, this elected chamber is here considering a bill put forward by a chamber of unelected people. We have a Conservative government giving priority or ceding priority to an ill-considered, reactionary, and potentially harmful bill from the unelected Senate, while at the same time shutting down debate in this elected chamber, as they've done 100 times already, as has been the fate of nearly 60 bills to date on matters that elected representatives of this chamber want to debate. In all, Mr. Speaker, what a fitting way for this government to close out the final days of this Parliament, and what an unfortunate way for Canada and Canadians. Thank you.
Questions?